The old Uno reverse card might be being activated again. It was only a couple of weeks ago that we were discussing why Belarus had not joined the Ukraine war as an active participant, despite its long-held Union state status with Russia, and despite a much more far-flung ally having joined the fray. But now we have Zelensky openly threatening to strike Belarus should Ukraine's demands not be met. It is the latest development as the wave of optimism continues to permeate the West. However, will this ultimately be tough but meaningless talk, or will Ukraine's threats actually start to go somewhere? Well, today, let's try to get to the bottom of this. We will begin with a brief overview of Belarus's role in the war so far, with an emphasis on Ukraine's current security concern. Then we will look at the threat that Ukraine has issued, whether it is your standard meaningless cheap talk, or if something might come out of it. Lastly, we will zoom in on what exactly Ukraine's menu of options looks like, and the risks and rewards that come with each. But let's start with Belarus's role in the war thus far. And the best description there is, not much. Minsk's most critical role was to act as a staging ground for the February 2022 invasion. That very narrow part worked to perfection. Russia's actual execution of the invasion did not, though, which is why we are still talking about this more than 4 years later. Certainly, the Kremlin has sought active support from Belarus, but Lukashenko has resisted those calls. Anyone on the outside can observe that the war has been a strategic defeat for Russia, so voluntarily joining the fight would be silly. Never mind that there is decent internal resistance to the Lukashenko government, and the last time that things boiled over, the specter of a Russian intervention discouraged outright rebellion. And there is no guarantee that the Kremlin could offer such support today. That leaves Belarus to offer passive support, which has very much continued beyond the initial staging grounds. To begin, there are reports every now and then of Russia flying drones directly over Belarus to strike Ukraine. You can see that the geography here would make this attractive just from a distance perspective. But there is also a strategic defensive component. Ukraine exerts so much effort to install anti-drone defenses in the east that cheating through Belarus looks like a smart idea. That connects to a second component of passive Belarusian support, which is much better documented. Russia will fly drones along the Belarus-Ukraine border, again as a means to reduce Ukraine's ability to fire air defenses at those targets. But perhaps the most pervasive support role Belarus plays is to provide navigation and fire correction. Basically, Russia can place a bunch of relay stations inside of Belarus. Those stations can then talk to Russian drones as they fly into and around Ukraine, extending communication ranges closer to their final targets. They can also assist Russian drones that get jammed and fly into Belarus to regain their bearings and head back to Ukraine. Outside of the military sphere, Belarus has assisted Russia with oil refining, both gasoline for the Russian domestic market and diesel for the Russian war machine. Circa 2022, this sentence would have seemed silly. But with Ukraine's never-ending strikes on Russian oil refineries, it is now a fact of life. Russia needs help filling demand on both sides of the civil-military divide, and Belarus is one of the few countries that can easily step into that role. One final note on what Ukraine is not so worried about: a repeat of the February 2022 invasion path. Sure, it may one day be possible that Russia tries this again, but the Kremlin would first need to amass men and materiel to the location, in quantities that would be apparent to everyone. And even if Russia tries to do something sneaky, there are so many people in the area that could turn into an overnight militia that the strategy would not be effective anyway. Thus, there is a bunch of areas that Belarus is helping Russia with, but trying to keep Ukraine honest about another front is barely a blip on the radar. That takes us to the end of last week, when Zelensky issued an ultimatum to Belarus: kick out Russia, or watch Ukraine do it on Belarus's behalf, effectively dismissing Lukashenko's notion that Belarus is not in the war. Given everything else going on in the world right now, though, you might not have had time to reflect on it, especially if you primarily consume left-of-center news media. The story actually had more coverage from leans left outlets than anywhere else, but further left publications were notably quiet about it. And even if you did see the story, you might not have read the same version of it. Left-leaning outlets tended to frame it with the moral and humanitarian aspects of the story, while right-leaning outlets tended to focus on the geopolitical relationship between Belarus and Russia. I know of these differences thanks to the returning sponsor of today's video, Ground News. They are always there for you by delivering The Blind Spot, a rundown of stories that certain segments of the media landscape miss. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan to get access to all of this and more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Anyway, you could tell that Zelensky meant business. Belarus only had 1 week to comply, as opposed to the usual 2-week warning. In all seriousness though, your proper first reaction should have been to tap the sign. Don't listen to what leaders say. There is all the incentive to bluff here. If Belarus thinks that Ukraine is serious, then it might evict Russia. That would give Ukraine exactly what it wants without having to lift a finger, which would give a weaker type of Ukraine the incentive to bluff strength. In turn, the declaration by itself cannot provide meaningful information that would alter how Belarus would respond. Now, the problem with our modern world's response to cheap talk is that we have often broken too far the other way. Verbal threats are not inherently lies. Trump said it, therefore it must be false, has become a bit of a meme, but I worry that too many people literally believe that, and believe that at their own peril, perhaps as Iran should have taught us. All that the first half of the sign warns us is that the act of saying things does not convey much information one way or another. And if Lukashenko looks at the second half of the sign, he might start to get worried, which seems to be the case based on his recent efforts to thaw diplomatic relations with Ukraine. You have probably seen these territorial exchange figures a dozen times by now. A few months of Ukrainian gains concentrated in Zaporizhia after about a year and a half of persistent Russian control over the war's tempo. Those gains appear to be slowing in June, but the biggest cause seems to be Ukraine's campaign to take out Russian logistics using newly developed mid-range drones. Well, do you know what else those mid-range drones would be good at taking out? All of that Russian stuff sitting in Belarus. Here is another way to frame the situation. A lot of diplomacy is each party trying to persuasively explain to the other side what the structure of the game is. It is all over those books on the shelf. Volumes of simultaneously fascinating and painfully boring conversations about the capabilities and political concerns that each rival diplomat has, with invitations for the other side to do their own research to verify that information. In that light, Lukashenko is having to weigh his options. Not because Zelensky told him to, but because something else is in the air. And it is not love in Russia's near abroad. It is those drones. And Lukashenko's decision comes down to what he expects might happen if he does not buckle to Zelensky's demand. Well, the next question is what Ukraine might actually do here. Those mid-range drones make attacking Belarus plausible. They still do not guarantee that Ukraine will want to follow through. So what happens if Belarus calls Ukraine's bluff? There are 3 clear options here. One is to sit back and do nothing. Option 2 is to open up strikes on Russian targets. Option 3 is to add Belarusian oil infrastructure to the list. Option 1 is the baseline for comparison, so I do not have much to directly add to it, other than it is possible that Zelensky's original comments were a pure bluff. At the same time, Ukrainian intelligence is claiming that Russia is building up the equipment to use Belarus as a forward launch site for a new wave of drone attacks, so there is another strike against the pure bluff theory. Notably, part of this claim cites Belarus saying that Ukraine is preparing for attacks on Belarus, giving us a fun preemptive war flavor to these proceedings. And sorry if that last sentence gave you a bit of whiplash. Skipping to option 3, attacking oil infrastructure would be interesting. Oil products are definitely dual use, but it is difficult to claim that Belarus is militarily contributing to Russia's war effort through the oil trade, at least as by the standard international norms on the subject. It is also hard to see how Ukraine would avoid inflicting civilian casualties when hitting oil infrastructure. From there, Belarus would be primed to retaliate. Essentially, Belarus has had all of the reason in the world to avoid being an active combatant in the war, and Ukraine would just be pulling them in anyway. The only way this works is if Belarus is somehow extremely reluctant to get involved in a war, but also has the ability to politically put its foot down and force Russia out of the country. And while I am sure that Kyiv would find it hilarious that Russia would have to further dilute its air defenses inside of Russia proper, I suspect that is not worth Belarus marshaling some of its forces against Ukraine. Just for some perspective, Ukraine imports crude oil from Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. And breaking news, Ukraine uses oil for its war machine. Imagine one day that Russia decided to strike their respective oil infrastructure. Would they just sit there in response? What about Greece, Poland, Lithuania, and Turkey, which import oil products into Ukraine? Would they also take it lying down? Certainly not in response to an overt attack. That is Article 5 territory. Maybe a covert attack, because things like that are probably already happening. The war is full of dirty secrets, isn't it? Actually, that suggests to Ukraine a better alternative here. You have worked with Belarusian resistance before. Why not work with them again on some new targets? Fittingly, Zelensky met with the exiled Belarusian opposition leader, who has a history of showing up in unexpected places, at the end of May. Back on the overt front, there is a middle ground here. Limit the strikes to Russian military targets. This has more potential because it is unclear whether Lukashenko is particularly satisfied with the current arrangement anyway. Belarus has been militarily tied to Russia ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, but the reasoning traditionally ran the opposite direction. Any military threats to Russia would have to pass through Belarus first, so Minsk could free ride off of Moscow, as Russian troops would be better off confronting their challengers in Belarus than at the Russian border. In contrast, here Russia is using Belarus as a forward operating base to go on the offensive in Ukraine. That might make Minsk a fair-weather ally, happy to play if the war is going great, suddenly skeptical when things are not so hot. Well, things are not so hot. So there is a ton of upside for Ukraine here. Best case scenario, it strains Union-state relations, and Russia pulls its assets out of Belarus. More realistic case scenario, the strain forces the Kremlin to offer more to Minsk to keep the relationship running. This is still a win for Ukraine. Better that Lukashenko control millions of dollars than the Kremlin. Worst case scenario, assuming that Belarus does not want to stick up for itself at all, Russia continues to operate the systems inside of the country. But now it must protect those systems from Ukrainian drones. So suddenly a bunch of anti-drone defenses get pulled elsewhere from Russian-held territory, leaving yet more holes for Ukrainian drones to sneak through there. This is also consistent with existing norms about third-party interventions into this conflict. NATO countries do not permit Ukraine to fly drones over their territory. The closest you get to this is Russia deliberately jamming Ukrainian drones to crash into NATO territory as a troll. NATO does not even station anti-drone defenses in Ukraine, despite many Russian aircraft having breached NATO borders. Heck, NATO at times has watched Russian drones fly back into Ukraine. The underlying NATO strategy here is to maintain an arm's length from the war, and thus remain outside of overt kinetic action from Russia. In this framing, Belarus has deviated from the international norm, making it fair game. Ukraine taking action is intended to sanction Belarus and force it to fall back in line with the norm. Thus, I expect something to happen here if Belarus fails to respond to the ultimatum. There are just too many exposed targets in the country that were not so exposed as of 6 months ago. What is hard to read is how much agency Belarus has in any of this beforehand. If Lukashenko does not know how to say no to Putin, then this is academic. There is no bargaining problem between Ukraine and Belarus, and this is purely a continuation of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And we all know how swimmingly the attempts to resolve that conflict have gone. However, the threats may all cancel out at a meta level. Remember, this began with Ukraine claiming that Russian assets are threatening to strike Ukraine. They may very well stay there, untouched, with Ukraine's capacity deterring further use. Sorry if you find the lack of kinetic action disappointing. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? There is a lingering possibility that Ukraine may take active measures to strike Belarus. The ongoing media discussion of this stems from a comment from Zelensky, but really the focus ought to be on Ukraine's mid-range strike campaign, which makes an operation feasible now, whereas it was not before. And I suspect that the scope of a potential strike would be more limited than Ukraine's threats currently suggest. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Head over to ground.news/linesonmaps to take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan. Meanwhile, you can also head over to my secondary channel to learn more about the overall Ukraine-Belarus relationship going in the opposite direction, why Belarus has not done more. Plus, there is an interesting tangent about how this photo came to be. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.